Hi all, Dr. Clark here, and today for forest management, we're going to talk about measuring standing trees, but the measurement we're going to talk about is DBH, or diameter at breast height. All right. So we talked before about canopy cover, age, tree height, but DBH really gives you a lot of that information. And the reason why I say that is if you know something about the type of tree that you're measuring, so let's say you're taking a measurement of ponderosa pine, and that's your forest is ponderosa pine. You would know because you calculate the height of trees. You would know what height corresponds to a certain DBH. So if you knew what the DBH was, you'd know how that corresponded to the height. Okay, it's kind of like a weight and a length of, a living organism. If you know the weight, then you pretty much know the length, or vice versa. Now, of course, there are always situations where some trees might be fatter and shorter, but in general, it gives you a good reference point to where you can just go through and you can just take the DBHs of the trees, and that gives you some information about the height. It also gives you information because if you're managing for timber production, it will give you information about, well, how many board feet can you get out of that single tree? And then you just work your way, and maybe you're checking a bunch of trees in a given, region, and then you're going to go check a different side of the mountain or a different side of a hill or ravine or something like that to see what the DBHs over there are and how that corresponds. And the other thing DBH often will give you is if you've cored a few trees in that region, you can, calculate the age and DBH, so the equivalent. So maybe a 5-year-old tree might have a 10 centimeter DBH, and that would give you that kind of corresponding age to DBH. The more corresponding variables you can figure out, the better it is as a manager of a forest because it limits or makes things go much quicker. It's a lot faster to wrap a DBH tape around a tree and get the DBH and move on to the next tree than it is to core the tree, or it is to calculate the height of the tree. So by doing so, you can move through a tree stand much faster, utilize your time better. Is it perfect? Of course not. Okay? But it gives you a rough estimate, and that's probably all you need to make some managerial decisions. Okay, so we're going to talk quite a bit about DBH because if you do DBH correctly, it can give you a lot of information. Okay, so tree diameters, like I was just saying, this is probably the most frequent tree measurement. It's the easiest one to take, and it gives you a lot of information as long as you have those other variables in which you've calculated before, or you can pull them up from previous data collection events and things like that. Okay, so DBH stands for diameter at breast height, and I should preface this: diameter at breast height of basically an individual that's 6 foot tall. Okay, so the diameter at breast height means you're taking the diameter at 4.5 feet. Okay, so if you're 5'2", diameter at breast height means that you're still taking the measurement at 4.5 feet. You're not taking it at 3.5 feet. Okay, if you're 7 foot tall, you're not taking the diameter at 6 foot. Okay, you're still taking it at 4.5 feet. Okay, so it's kind of a notion, a kind of a weird term because it's actually not breast height for a lot of individuals. But since average height of people in the United States is roughly 6 foot for males, and then 4.5 feet is about that diameter at breast height. Okay. DBH is taken again from 4.5 feet above the ground level. Okay, and it includes the outside bark. Now there are ways to calculate DBH without using the outside bark. You'd have to know how thick the bark was, right? And then you can correct for that DBH measurement. That's valuable if you have a bark, what we call bark punches, or if you have, like a sharpened screwdriver or anything like that. You can stick it into the bark and you can see what the thickness of the bark is, and then you can correct for that average stem diameter or the DBH, including the bark. When you do so, and a lot of managers will do that, they are getting at actual usable wood. Okay, so if someone's calculating DBH and correcting for the bark, then they're getting at the actual amount of usable wood. Okay, because the bark's not really usable, it's often removed, and then you can get to the usable wood. All right. If you're looking at getting a DBH and you're on a hillside, you take the DBH. So if you got a tree that's growing on a hillside, you take the DBH on the upside of the hill. All right. So not downside of the tree, the upside of the tree is where the DBH comes in. And there are quite a few different tools that you can use to get DBH. I say that probably the one that's used most often is a diameter tape or a DBH tape. But old timers still carry Biltmore sticks, and that's perfectly fine. It's a rough estimate. Tree calipers are pretty good, but they're just measuring a uniform thickness of a tree. You're not measuring the actual entire cylinder. You're just measuring between 2 points. So I'd say the DBH tapes are probably the most used and most precise, and they're really easy to use. So they kind of replace the calipers and the stick, but I'll talk about them all. Okay, so DBH again, it's the most often used method, and it's the most consistent method. Okay? And as I said before, that's as long as it's done correctly. If the DBH is done sloppy, or an individual doesn't know how to do the DBH, is not taking it at 4.5 feet, or they don't know how to take the DBH, if you have irregular trees, then the method is not very good. As long as you follow the instructions and follow the consistency of the method, DBH is it's a great stat or a great piece of data to have as a manager. Okay, calipers, just a little bit about them. They're quick, simple. Again, most people know what a caliper is. I'll show you a picture of it, but caliper is just, measuring the distance between 2 points. It's pretty simple. You stick it on the tree, get the measurement, move on to the next tree. Really easy. Works good, but again, it's not the best method in my opinion. Okay, a Biltmore stick, it's more simple than caliper. You're just putting a stick up against the tree, and you're measuring from between the 2 points, and you just head on to the next tree. It's really easy, really quick, but again, it's a crude method because you're measuring a cylinder by just examining 2 points, and on top of that, you're eyeballing it because you're sticking a stick up to something that is circular. So you're kind of eyeballing the 2 points. And DBH tapes, this is a DBH tape. I would argue that this is the best method. it wraps around the tree, and you then take a DBH reading off the tape. Most of them calculate the diameter for you, not just the circumference. If you're using a regular tape, then you're just actually getting the circumference of the circle, and you have to then back calculate to diameter. Like I said, most of these methods are going to give you diameter. So the calipers are specialized calipers to give you the diameter of the tree. But like I said before, it's measuring 2 points versus this one measuring all the points around the tree. And because trees look uniform, but they're not uniform in circumference. They're not perfect circles. And so especially if you have trees that are growing on different slopes and things like that, one side might get more sun than the other side. One might get more damage than the other side. You might have a different thickness of the bark on one side than the other side. So there are a lot of components that can go into that. Okay, so calipers. There are a couple different types of calipers. Okay, there's some that are, more familiar to some people that have taken other science classes where you have, these flat calipers that you just stretch out, put on a bone or something like that. That's similar caliper. Okay, but these are specialized in the sense that they tell you the diameter. And then Biltmore rulers or Biltmore sticks. Again, this is an old method. This is a method that used to be done quite often. Still done by some people, but I would argue that the DBH tape is probably done by most. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happens with those irregular trees, because the trees are not regular cylinders. They change shape. They often have malformed regions, or maybe they have multi-splits. Okay. So again, let's talk about those irregular tree stems. This could be forks. This can be, hourglass-shaped trees or vase-shaped trees. This could be trees that are, roots are visible. There's all kinds of ways at which a tree can have an irregular shape. And more often than not, you're going to come across these if you're doing much of a, data collection in a given forest. Okay, so a tree on a slope, again, a tree on a level ground, a leaning tree, all of them is 4.5 feet. Okay, that is the diameter of breast height. Now, where you take the measurement will depend. Okay, again, if the tree's on a slope, you take it from the uphand side or up the hillside of that tree. Level ground, it makes no difference. A leaning tree, it really doesn't make a difference. You normally measure it on the side that is leaning away. Okay, again, but as long as it's not on a slope, it makes no difference. Okay, if there's a fork at or above the 4.5 feet, okay, you just go a little bit below that and get the DBH of the tree. If the fork is below 4.5 feet, you need to take the DBH 3.5 feet above the fork for each fork. So if you have a tree that's forking below 4.5 feet, you're going to take a DBH of both limbs. Okay, or both trunks. I'll show you an example of this in a second. Okay, if the tree is deformed at 4.5 feet, you just go above that deformed piece, and you can get a DBH from just above that 4.5 foot mark. Okay. If you have a bottleneck tree, and that bottlenecking event happens near or around that 4.5 foot mark, okay, you need to get outside of the bottleneck region. So normally you'll move a foot and a half outside of the bottleneck region. I'll show you. Again, I'll show you the examples of these in a picture format. Okay. Here's the key one that a lot of people don't do and can really change your estimates of, how much a forest might be worth. So one of the reasons why I explain this to you, let's say you buy a piece of property and it's heavily forested, but you're like, well, maybe you're not even buying the property yet. Maybe you're going to make an estimate of, well, how much are the trees on this property worth? And this is what they're selling it for. So if I cleared a little, region of trees, how much I'm going to get for that? You could always do a DBH on the trees in a given region and get an estimate of what the tree worth is, and then you can base that on, well, how much is it going to cost to bring someone in to cut the trees, and all the other variables. But that's how you would get kind of an estimate of tree worth, is by taking it to DBH. The problem is a lot of people will hire someone to come in and do this. Okay? There are people that will come in and do your DBH, or they do a estimate of worth of your trees, and they do it all the time when there's heavy snow out. Well, those individuals, they don't do the DBH correctly. In fact, they often don't dig down. They don't dig down to the ground level to take the DBH. So let's say you have 2 feet of snow or even a foot of snow. Now the DBH that they're taking is at 5.5 feet or 6.5 feet. Well, that DBH is probably going to be smaller than at 4.5 feet. So your net worth of your forest that they're giving you an estimate for is going to be less. So if there's heavy snow, floods, anything like that, and you're taking DBH measurement, it has to be from the ground level. So you have to dig down, dig through the snow, dig through the ice until you get dirt. And then you're measuring that 4.5 feet up from that. Okay? And again, this is often, especially with the snow, it's just not done. Flooding conditions, the individual's probably standing on level ground. Although I've seen flood conditions where people have done DBHs from a boat. Okay, it's not the way you do a DBH. And like I said before, it's a great data analysis tool and great chunk of data. But if you do it incorrectly, then like anything, it's pretty much worthless. Okay, so let's look at some of these. So let's say you come to a tree. It's got a fork, but the fork is above that 4.5 feet. No worries. You take your DBH at 4.5 feet. Okay. Come to another tree. That fork is below the 4.5 feet. Now at 4.5 feet, if it's far below, then at 4.5 feet, it's fine to take the DBH of both the trunks that are coming off. If it's really close, then you really need to move away from the fork by that 3.5 feet mark. So that could make it way out there. You could be close to 7 feet where you're taking the DBHs of these two trunks. Okay, it really depends on where that fork occurs. Okay, if it's low in the tree, then take the DBH of the two trunks at the 4.5 mark. Okay, let's say you have a big knot or burrow or something, or major damage that occurs in the region at that 4.5 feet mark. Okay, you just need to move above that damaged region. Okay? Normally, maybe 6 to 8 inches to 12 inches, a foot away from the damaged area, and take the DBH there. Okay, let's say you got a vase or you kind of got this bottle top tree, okay, and that's happening at kind of the 4 foot mark. You need to get away from that, okay, about a 1.5 foot outside of that bottleneck to get a good DBH measurement. Okay, pretty simple. These are just rules that people use mainly so if I'm looking at someone's DBH data and they followed these set rules, then I know that when they came to a tree and I see, oh, look, they have 2 DBH measurements for this tree. Okay, they have this one point, this one GPS location, and they have 2 DBH measurements. That tells me right away, hey, there is a fork in that tree that occurs somewhere below the 4.5-foot mark. Okay, and that's really simple for me to get that kind of data because people follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules and you're like, oh, fork, no, I'm just going to take it down here, then I don't know that that tree forked by looking at the data. Other situations that'll often happen, especially in regions that maybe you're looking at old growth forests and things like that, you might have the roots or the root crown that's above ground. So maybe it's growing around a rock or a log or something like that. You need to take a measurement, though, from the upper portion of the root crown, where this would be ground level. Okay, so this down here where you can see the roots is not ground level. So this would be ground level if the roots were buried. Okay, and you take 4.5 feet from that, that's where your DBH is. Okay? So that's just kind of a rule of thumb on the different measurements and the different situations that you might find yourself in when taking DBH measurements. Okay? And we'll get to this, and I'll show you some examples in some videos of me taking DBH measurements, and I'll show you the different situations that you can get into. Okay. All right. The last thing is, I told you before, we're trying to, in some cases, we're trying to calculate the usable wood by just examining the DBH. And so that would be not a DBH, or we wouldn't label them as DBHs. We'd instead label them what they actually are. DIBs, or diameters inside the bark, okay, or DOBs, diameter outside the bark. Okay. So again, DOBs are simple. Okay, they're easy. You just wrap the DBH tape around the tree, get your number, move on. DIBs, you're going to have to do some calculation. Okay. Now, the DIBs, they're useful in calculating tree volume, or the usable amount of tree. And like I said before, you have to be able to estimate the bark depth to get at that tree volume. Okay, so you can use different things. Bark gauges. Often you might see if you're around someone who's doing bark thickness for kind of a management situation, maybe they work for the Forest Service, they'll probably use a bark gauge. If you're around someone who might be a logger, or someone who is going to just cut and the volume can be a little more loose, they might just use a sharpened screwdriver with an inch or two marked on the screwdriver, and they just jam it into the tree, okay, and get their measurement that way. If you're with somebody who might be doing research, and maybe they're a graduate student or a professor or something like that, often they'll use like an auger bit, okay, with exact measurements on it, and they'll drill in until they hit the bark and then move it back. Sometimes, though, people will kill 2 birds with 1 stone, as the saying goes, and that auger bit is actually the auger that you're using to get your core sample. So you're going through the bark to get a core sample, and when you pull it out, then you have how much bark you have, and you just take a bark thickness measurement there. A lot of researchers will do that at the same time. So they'll get their core so they can get their age, but at the tip of that core, at the end of that core, they're going to have their chunk of bark in which they can get a measurement of the thickness. Same time, you're taking a DBH. They might also be taking the height of the tree, the canopy cover, the whole swath of pieces of data, but now they got it all. And then after you've got it all for quite a few trees, then you can make references to that forest. Okay, it looks like the trees have about this bark thickness. Okay, the majority of them have, you know, this amount of thickness for this DBH. Okay, they have this age for this DBH. They're this height for this DBH. Okay, and then you can make those correlations between those variables. Okay, DOB, like I said, this is calculated either using calipers, using a DBH tape, using a bit more stick. Pretty simple. Diameter outside the bark is pretty easy. Now, in some cases, if you're using calipers and you know the diameter of the bark, or you know the width of the bark, then you can just subtract that from the DOB and you can get your DIB. Okay? But often, when people are using things like diameter tapes or even calipers and they're not taking the measurements and they're not taking into account the thickness on the tips, okay, then you must use a calculator to get at this. So I can pull up this calculator. Maybe I can pull this calculator up. Yeah, so if you're looking at these calculators, then maybe you're after the inner diameter. That's what you want. So let's say your outer diameter was 25 and the width of the bark, let's say it was 2, okay, and we don't know the area and we don't know the inner diameter, so then we can just calculate it. It gives us the area, okay, and it gives us the inner diameter. Okay, really simple. I'll let you guys play around with this at a later date. I'll give you guys kind of an assignment to do that. But nonetheless, it's a pretty simple method to get that inner diameter. And that inner diameter, you know, it's appropriate to have the area, but that inner diameter will give you an idea of how many board feet you can get off of that material that you're interested in. Okay. Okay, so with that, like I said before, once weather gets a little bit better, it might be later this week, I'll be posting videos that you can watch of me taking the height of certain trees, the DBH of trees, aging them, and then I will put together assignments in which you guys are going to use data that I've collected to calculate things like the height of the trees, the DBHs of the trees, the ages of the trees, these kind of things. So you can play with the numbers that I collected from forests nearby. Okay? So look forward to those future videos about these different techniques and collection methods, and we'll talk to you next time.